So our next speaker is the lovely Artemi, who works at the Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education. Are you in Western-super-Mare or Greece today, Artemi? Because I know quite often you're in Greece when I talk to you.
I am sometimes. No, I'm in Western-super-Mare today. Thank you, Hannah.
Awesome. Well, it's lovely to see you. I'm looking forward to listening to you talking about equality, working with the how can we question. So I'm going to disappear and then we'll come back in 10 minutes to ask you some questions.
Lovely, thank you. And many thanks for the invitation here and to all previous speakers, including Adrian just now. We're kind of staying on the same theme. We're going to be talking about the moral, and here we're going to be talking about the legal imperative as well. I'm going to, thank you for chickening out, Hannah, but it doesn't matter. I do answer to any approximation. I'm going to say my full name. It's Artemi Sakellariadis. Trained as a teacher for children with labels of special educational needs. And I've worked in special schools for many years before devoting all of my time and energy to developing more inclusive education. I've worked in a number of different roles. I've supported inclusion in ordinary schools. I've taught in further and higher education. And for the past 15 years, I've headed up CSIE, the Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education. It's a national charity working to promote equality in education. And we address equality through the lens of disability because there seems to be a heightened level of awareness on other aspects of equality, but disability equality seems to be lagging behind in education. So come with me on a journey. We're going to be kind of galloping through some thoughts about what the moral and the legal framework is for us to be doing this work and what it means, what the legacy we, yes, I'm thinking about the theme of legacy. I want to invite us all, a bit how Adrian before invited us all to think about what legacy we leave behind. I'm not quite sure I was very keen to write my own obituary, but thank you for the possibility of thinking about that. But I'd like to invite us all to think about the legacy of the past on today's education system and to think how everything that we do contributes to the legacy that we will leave behind for future generations. And I'd like to begin by sharing the words of Judith Snow, who was a disability rights advocate from Canada. And she writes, I'm going to read this, "When I was in high school, one of the students was an Olympic diver, a veteran with many medals. My community seemed to know just what she needed to continue to be both a gifted diver and one of our classmates. We knew that she needed access to the swimming pool at 5:30 every morning. She needed tutoring to keep up when she traveled. She needed friends, recognition, and to graduate along with us. She needed a volunteer sports club locally and various national and international organizations to maintain her opportunities to dive." Now, Judith Snow goes on to say that a disabled student needs exactly the same sort of opportunities and structure to participate in school, but somehow adults seem to find it more exciting to support an Olympic diver to achieve in sport, and maybe sometimes a bit of a burden to support, or maybe unnecessary to support a disabled child to attend their local school. Now, you will notice today that I'm a passionate advocate of disability equality in education, and I want to use this opportunity to encourage everyone in this virtual room to explore their own thinking, to see what assumptions they may uncover and decide how to respond to them. And I want to make it very clear right from the very start that I don't see my role as telling anybody what to do or what to think. I just want to share my perspective and invite everybody else to make of that what you will. So let me return to Judith Snow for now and her suggestions that there seems to be an implicit value judgment in deciding how to respond to children's educational needs. Now, we all know that we should not judge a book by its cover. Sorry, I saw 1 minute to go, but that can't be mine. Excuse the distraction. So we all know that not to judge a book by its cover, but disabled people often say that they feel invisible because they are frequently ignored or avoided. Now, when I deliver disability awareness workshops for pupils in schools, I always make a point of saying that we all have more similarities, more in common with each other than differences, that some differences are so visible that sometimes people don't look beyond them and don't notice the similarities. And children get this, of course. So when children and young people with labels of SEND apply for a place in our settings, I suggest that we all make a habit of asking, how can we? Instead of the perhaps more conventional, can we? which invites a kind of binary response, which invites the possibility of saying no as a response. Andy Moffat spoke this morning about the need for education, for us as educators, to prepare children and young people for life in 21st century Britain. And I know I've often heard Richard Reeser from the world of inclusion often say that if we are to live in society together, we need to go to schools together. Without that, prejudice and discrimination just persist. So let's pause and think for a moment what the legacy of the past means for our education system today. So the idea that every child should go to school was something that was established more than 100 years ago, when disabled people were thought to have no place in mainstream society. And schools were initially designed for the majority of children without anybody thinking that disabled children should go to school as well. And only later, as disabled children's need for education was gradually acknowledged, did separate schools begin to spring up, initially for children who were blind or deaf, and later others as well. Now, by now, our social values have changed and disability equality is far better understood and accepted in society. But education, I think, continues to operate on this dual system of mainstream for most and separate special schools for those who are thought not to fit in to mainstream schools as we know them. And looking at this dual system through the lens of disability equality today, I would suggest is likely to paint a picture of institutional discrimination against disabled people. Now, the way we understand disability shapes our understanding of disabled children's rights and their needs, and all of that has an impact on how education is organized. So I suggest that inclusion is a fundamental right of everybody. It's a fundamental human rights question for which education has yet to find an effective and appropriate answer. I wish we had longer to tell you all about international legislation and local legislation, but we're just going to whiz through this. And I'll just say that, at least internationally, the intention is clear and very visibly, very clearly articulated. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Salamanca Statement and Framework of Action, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, Sustainable Development Goal number 4, they all say exactly the same thing, that with regard to disabled children's education, the goal should be inclusion in mainstream schools, in ordinary schools. And you know, the UK has been repeatedly criticised for failing to develop this. National laws state something similar, but you could be forgiven not to know this, given what is happening in practice. Laws are not strictly enforced, is the simplest thing I can say. The Equality Act 2010 states that all public bodies, including schools, have a duty to eliminate discrimination. We all know this, to advance equality of opportunity, to foster good relationship between people who have and don't have protected characteristic. And it also places the duty to make reasonable adjustments in response to people's impairments in order to create equality of opportunity. And what is not widely known is that this duty is an anticipatory duty. So it's not owed to those children or members of staff who might knock on our school's door wanting a way in and we have to do something in response to them. No, it is owed to all disabled people collectively. We have to create our schools in readiness for any disabled child or young person or member of staff wanting to come along and join our school. So it's an anticipatory duty. We have to act on it. Again, who checks? Who knows what happens? Food for thought here. We've also got the Children and Families Act, and we'll return to that in a moment. Thank you for the prompt. I've just seen that. I think I'm okay on time. And the code of practice that's linked to it. Now, the code of practice, I'm going to read something out here. The code of practice actually says that the government is committed to inclusive education, and the law presumes that all children and young people will be educated in a mainstream school. Again, given what happens in practice, you could be forgiven for not knowing that it says that. About the Children and Families Act, how it pans out in practice. We know from last year's Ofsted report, Old Issues, New Issues, Next Steps, that old issues are still lingering. The statutory framework has changed, but things have not been resolved. So we've had an indication from Ofsted. We now are awaiting any day now the publication of the SEND review, and it's widely expected to say that things have not panned out as expected, and we know that there will be a white paper, the school's white paper published alongside it, that will be recommending significant changes. So for now, I'd like to suggest that we're left in a vicious circle where the need for change is not widely understood. In the sector, the laws which call for change are not strictly enforced, and this leaves us with an ongoing anomaly in the system, where education practice remains in conflict with education laws, but nobody seems to mind because things have been happening this way for a very long time. I will, if I have time to read just one little bit before I jump to my 1 minute end. I'll read something from the blog of Will Quince, the Children and Families Minister, who wrote in anticipation of the SEND review a blog confirming the government's commitment to developing a more inclusive system and strengthening mainstream provision to ensure that this happens. And he says it's important to remember that while we do have specialists, every single teacher in this country is an SEND teacher. It's not the first time we've heard this, but we're going to see it in black and white. We're determined to keep, this is Will Quince's blog, we're determined to keep developing teachers' skills and confidence and promote evidence-based effective practice within schools and other settings. We know that recent evidence suggests a twofold benefit of including disabled children in ordinary schools. It leads to improved educational outcomes for disabled as well as non-disabled children, and it confirms that inclusive education better supports social and emotional development for all children, disabled as well as non-disabled. So it's hard to argue against that. So I think, in my view, if we are to create a real equality of opportunity for disabled children, we really need a culture shift in education, and we need to transform our education system, make it fit for the 21st century. And we need for that to build capacity in ordinary schools to respond to the needs of all learners. So this is my 1 minute close. I want to invite you all to become agents of change. Think about what you might be able to do within your own sphere of influence to help promote disability equality in education and leave a more positive legacy for those who follow. CSI would love to help you on this journey. By all means, you can engage with our resources. Our Equality Toolkit for Schools has received an international award. Invite us to deliver equality workshops for your staff, to support you in carrying out policy review, an equality, whole school equality audit. And if nothing else, please make a habit of asking how can we instead of can we question. And I want to leave you with the words of Peter Hick, who is now Professor of Inclusive Education at Edge Hill University. And he says, we all have a part to play in promoting more inclusive education. None of us should be paralyzed by saying it's the system, it's the funding, it's this barrier, it's that barrier. We all have some area in which we have some kind of influence. It may be one student, maybe one group, it may be one classroom, it may be a school, it may be one teacher education course. But wherever we find ourselves, we can promote more inclusion and more inclusive education in our own settings. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Artemi. It's always wonderful to listen to you. You are so knowledgeable about this world. We do have time for some questions, and I've got a question on behalf of, newly qualified teachers, ECTs rather.
Yes.
But in this space, when I started teaching in my first year, unqualified in 2003, I had a student with microcephaly in my classroom with one TA and absolutely no idea how to navigate this child's needs. And I'm interested in what advice you would give to young teachers who are in the profession who are faced with this kind of throwing in the deep end attitude. What do they do? Where do they go? How do they react?
The first thing I say is what not to do. Don't attempt to do it alone. Inclusion is a collaborative effort. So the first thing you want to do is speak to your colleagues, see who's got experience, who can help you, who your senior leadership can put you in touch with somebody else. Speak to the child's parents, speak to the child themselves. They are the best notes. There are quote unquote experts out there who might know everything that there is to know about microcephaly. But this child and their parents know everything that there is to know about this child, and they are also the experts to talk to. So by all means, speak to everybody who's engaged in this child's education and trust your gut feeling, because if a good teacher is always a good inclusive teacher. If we know our kind of pedagogy, the knowledge about pedagogy enables us to move facilitate somebody's learning to get them from A to B. It really doesn't matter how big the step is or where A or B are, but a good teacher is always a good teacher, no matter who their learner is.
So one of the things that you said really struck me about this analogy about the Olympic swimmer. And it makes so much sense, doesn't it? The idea that we would put in so much effort to support somebody who's doing something extraordinary, and that same effort being leveraged for a child with a disability. Now, the criticism or sometimes the kind of blocker might be, well, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources, we don't have the funding. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's exactly why I like mentioning the Olympic diver example from Judith Snow, because it brings to the fore this kind of implicit thinking that I'm sure is out there, that is not always acknowledged, that some people, it's not worth the time or effort. There is a very widespread perception that separate special schools are tailor-made to cater for the needs of some children. That is not so. There is no place that is tailor-made. There's nothing that happens in a special school that cannot happen in an ordinary school. So I'm afraid I've lost my train of thought there. What was the question again?
The question is about the criticism, or we don't have time or funding to do this, and especially
Yes.
teachers who are just starting in their career, who don't perhaps have the influence that some more experienced teachers have. How would you respond to
Thank you
those?
for reiterating the question, because I don't want to underestimate the importance of time and support and funding. I'm not saying that you don't need it, but I would like to say that where there's a will, there's a way. And there are some wonderful examples of inclusive practice where there hasn't been the funding. And you're reminding me of the words of Micheline Mason. Micheline Mason was the person who set up the Alliance for Inclusive Education many, many years ago. And in response to the reservation that, we don't have the resources to include somebody in an ordinary school, she was saying every school has incredible amount of resources available for free. The other children, don't let us not striate our thinking. Let us not imagine that it is only the qualified teachers who are responsible for a child's learning and development. A child going to school will also, they learn to read and write, but they'll learn how to be a 5-year-old, they'll learn how to be a 10 and 15-year-old. They need their peers in order to learn that.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Artemi. Your expertise is always welcomed. Please do have a look at the work of CSIE on Twitter so that you can see some more detail of what she's doing.